Hello and welcome everyone to a new episode here on the War of the Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, and today it feels like another day in the Irish world. We are going to talk about some more Irishmen today, this time, however, with a historian. Last time we had a literary scholar. So today we are joined by Ian Delahanty. He
Yep.
is a professor, associate professor. He just came back from Faculty Senate before the meeting here.
Hmm.
He is an associate professor of history at Springfield College in Massachusetts with a PhD from Boston College. So very New England in outlook. And we are talking about, I think I got that right, his first book,
Yep.
Embracing Emancipation, A Transatlantic History of Irish Americans, Slavery, and the American Union, 1840 to 1865, published this summer, 2024, by Fordham University Press. So first of all, Ian, thank you so much for joining me here today and taking some time this afternoon for you in Massachusetts out of your busy teaching schedule. So you already told me before the interview you are Irish American, not Irish.
And a little bit of some other things
Little,
too. So
it's a little,
a
yeah, it's
smattering
pretty
of the
common.
British Isles and some other parts too.
So how do you write a book about the Irish?
So when I was in grad school, I had an office across from our director of graduate studies, and I would often hear him talk with prospective applicants. And the one thing he would always say is, in your letter of interest, don't talk about the family trip you took to Gettysburg when you were a kid. And I always wondered if it was a subtle message at me because that was exactly what got me interested in this project. When I was, I think, 19 years old, I went to Gettysburg, did the battlefield tour, but was struck by the Irish Brigade's monument there at this
Oh,
giant
okay.
Celtic cross,
Mm-hmm.
rocks, the Irish wolfhound at the base of it, and how just different and distinct it was from virtually all other monuments in the field.
Yeah.
And that really just kind of kindled, an interest in the Irish involvement and experience of the American Civil War that, really just kind of came to fruition, I guess, with the publication of the book, however many years later now. So, yeah, and it was a doctoral dissertation originally at Boston College that kind of laid dormant for a little while once I started a really teaching focused position here at Springfield College, and then finally wanted to get it across the finish line and did so as of June. So, yeah,
Nice. Well, congratulations. It does take a while to
thanks.
get those books done, especially with a heavy teaching load. Um, but yeah, no, it's interesting how Gettysburg comes back in so many ways to people. Like that's the movie was what started me on the path on the American
Yeah,
Civil War, actually. So it's
yeah,
it's it's really interesting and how that battle still influences people.
yeah.
Um, so as somebody who also has studied the Irish and kind of looked at especially immigration studies, 48er studies, in your case, obviously, like the potato famine refugees
Yeah.
that you're getting. You are using a really interesting approach at looking at the Irish because you don't start when they're getting off the boat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about why did you feel it was important to start with all these guys in Ireland?
Yeah. So, I was, I guess, trained, if you will, as an immigration historian. My
Hmm.
advisor, Kevin Kenny, is a leader in the field. And the kind of the approach to immigration history that I was taught was that it's inherently sort of transnational.
Hmm.
And to understand the experience of immigrants in America, you have to look at where they're coming from and the ways in which they continue to be, in touch with, in some material way, their places of origin. In some ways, I wanted to kind of take that approach from immigration history and kind of apply it to, otherwise a pretty standard kind of narrative of the Civil War, kind of looking at the sectional crisis in the Civil War, not just from an Irish American point of view, but from a kind of transatlantic
Right.
perspective that accounts for events from Ireland that kind of reverberate across the Atlantic.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's I think you do a great job of sort of illustrating that intellectual baggage that they're bringing that has been
Yeah.
formed and formulated in Ireland over the years leading up to their immigration. Um, Out of curiosity, did you have any like pushback from the press or from the reviewer about this sort of approach or
Not
um
really, no. In fact, it was really, I guess the feedback I got was to really emphasize
yeah.
the kind of transatlantic scope of the study. And in its first iteration as a dissertation, that had kind of faded from view once I got to the war years, where it really became much more concerned with events happening in the US, home
Mhm.
front and battlefield, right? And part of the process of turning it from a dissertation to a book really involved looking at the ways in which the continued kind of exchange of information, ideas, people, money between Ireland and America continued through the
Mhm.
war years and continued to shape the way that Irish Americans understood, viewed, and took part in the debate and now conflict over slavery. So I think that was a kind of area where it initially
Yeah.
probably wasn't as pronounced as it is in the book now.
Yeah, no, it's kind of curious where you were saying like this transatlantic Irish community because that's really what it is. It's a group of people with the same ethnicity or nationhood, if you want, that lives on two sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's even beyond that, right? The kind of diasporic
Yeah.
approach. Kia McMahon's book on the Irish kind of global press and global Irish identity
Hmm.
was a really influential, piece of scholarship that informed this my study, who looks at how it's not just even transatlantic; it's truly a kind of diasporic sense
Yeah.
of national identity that emerged really from
Hmm.
the aftermath of the famine and built over the next several decades.
Right.
So yeah, no, I think that it just made, especially just being in the source material, the way that Irish American newspapers are reporting on crop yields, ships departures, things of this nature back in Ireland, right? And then Irish newspapers are reporting on, debates over the fugitive slave law, right?
Hmm.
And the kind of really what we tend to oftentimes think of as these really internecine partisan politics of the sectional crisis are debated and interpreted and framed differently in Ireland, right? So I think that's what just allowed me to grasp that reality that this is a truly kind of transatlantic framework for in which Irish people took part in that larger debate.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that the other parts that sort of interesting, right? When you think about like you're looking at it from the perspective of abolition, emancipation, and the British are ahead of all of that. But then
Right.
there's also this notion of like Daniel O'Connell as sort of a liberator because he wants to brings Catholic emancipation to Ireland, and
Yeah.
so it's an interesting situation because we have sort of this Irish desire for emancipation from the British, and then you add this conversation about enslaved people in the Americas, British Empire and North America, that are also of concern with regard to abolition now and the end of
Sure.
enslavement. How does the Irish kind of manage this sort of situation because of these two emancipations that they're looking at and desiring, or in some cases not desiring, I guess.
Right. Right. So how do you distinguish between the abolition of slavery um, in some ways there's kind of three, right? There's British
Yeah.
abolition and British emancipation, right? In which Daniel O'Connell, like a leading Irish nationalist, plays a key role. It's where the origins of an organization I follow closely in the book, the Hibernian Anti-Slavery
Mhm.
Society, really got their start looking at the aftermath of British emancipation and trying to think about the equitable system of labor in British colonies and its aftermath.
Mhm.
So there's that piece. There's the piece of Catholic emancipation in
Mhm.
Ireland, and if you could push that forward, maybe Irish freedom at a kind of more political sense,
Yeah.
right? But then there's also the debate over slavery and freedom in the United States.
Mhm.
And Irish people are in various ways involved in all three of those because, in some ways they're kind of between these two empires and of both these two Atlantic world empires. in various ways, right? Politically with Britain, economically with Britain, through their mass emigration to the United States, and the kind of ways in which Irish Americans developed this kind of transatlantic identity, and also actual nationalist movements to try to shape events in Ireland. So yeah, I think that there's three different questions of freedom or slavery, if you will, that Irish people are kind of involved with. And the book really focuses on not as much the kind of British case, aside from acknowledging that O'Connell's a part of it,
Right.
the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society emerges from it, but really looking at how the questions about the freedom of Ireland and what that would mean were just inherently intertwined with questions over about the future of slavery in America, right? And that for Irish people, they couldn't sort of disentangle those two questions between the 1840s and the end of the Civil War.
Yeah, and I kind of was curious in terms of like how these two are kind of like the languages of the repeal and abolition kind of intertwine with each other too, because it's like that's sort of the challenge, right? Of like how do you linguistically potentially try to distinguish between these two?
Yeah. Yeah, and what was interesting to me, other historians have pointed this out, and Caleb McDaniel had a really important article back in 2011 about this, the way the Garrisonian abolitionists tried to, in fact, in some ways, adopted the language of Daniel O'Connell's repeal movement, repeal of in O'Connell's case, in the Irish case, it's repealing the Act of Union of 1801 that had made Ireland politically integrated with the British Empire, right? There's no more sovereign Irish Parliament because of that legislative act, right? And O'Connell's campaign to repeal it would have resulted in some type of Irish sovereignty, or the return of an Irish Parliament at the least to Dublin. And Garrisonians point to that and say, we also want to repeal a union, right? We also are going to repeal this detestable union with slaveholders and slavery that is created through the Constitution. And for a time, try to use that kind of framing, in a sense, to kind of appeal to Irish nationalists in Ireland, and I think also prospective immigrants in Ireland who were part of O'Connell's repeal movement, but also Irish Americans in the United States who are already, of course, in America, but are very closely following and in some ways contributing financially and rhetorically to the repeal movement back in Ireland. And a good chunk of the first half of the book is looking at how that transatlantic abolitionist movement tried but ultimately failed to win over Irish and Irish American support by wedding together this kind of the kind of cause for Irish freedom with the cause for Black freedom.
Okay, I have a question in mind, but the first thing I want to ask is, why do you think that is? Because a lot of people would probably be like, oh, it's racism in Ireland, but you kind of seem to indicate it's not that simple an answer.
Yeah, so I mean, this really, in some ways, goes back to like the first argument. Book really makes two interrelated arguments. The one tries to tackle this really like age-old paradox, at least going back to in scholarship like the 1930s. Abolitionists are asking this question on the eve of the Civil War, basically, which is why were Irish people who claimed to have been oppressed by landlords and British colonial authorities in Ireland, why are they taking the side of enslavers in the United States? And their answer is that it's abolitionists say, well, they're just sort of embracing the kind of racist language, the racist system of the United States in order to kind of fit in, basically, right? And there's different scholarly explanations for this. It's labor competition, the fears of labor competition between newly freed people and Irish immigrant workers, right? There's the idea that it was the Roman Catholic hierarchy that opposed pretty much all forms of social reform movements in the mid-19th century, especially abolitionism. And then there's the idea that it was a political kind of influence, right? It was the pro-slavery Democratic Party welcoming in the Irish and, courting their vote. And of course, the Irish would then not be rocking the boat on the Democratic Party's position on slavery, right? And those are all relevant and I think part of the equation. But to get back to your question, right, what I argue in the book is that it's really not just in the United States where Irish American positions on slavery are formed. They take shape in Ireland during and leading up to and during the Great Irish Potato Famine. And what happens during that time is that a kind of certain segment of the Irish nationalist movement comes to see abolitionism as being just inimical to the interests of Irish people, both socially and politically, right? And they come to conclude really early in the famine that abolitionism isn't just irrelevant to Irish people, but in fact, it's in some ways kind of oppositional to their interests. And that argument is kind of carried over across the Atlantic during the famine migration, including by some of those very same nationalists who are sent essentially into exile or flee Ireland in the aftermath of the failed 1848 rising there, right? And then it takes life from there, but has really essential origins in Ireland during the early period of the famine years.
Yeah, let's not go too far ahead with the Young
Sure.
Ireland, Irish Confederation
Yeah.
guys, because I do want to explore them quite a bit because it's a very fascinating story that you're pointing out with them coming over and kind of their impact on the Irish community. I wanted to
Yeah.
stay in Ireland for a minute longer
Sure.
because you already mentioned that the emergence of this Young Ireland movement, the Irish Confederation, is really a key and sort of the divergence within Ireland between in regard to abolitionist thought. And one of the criticisms that the Young Ireland movement is always pointing at the O'Connells is that it's very heavily focused on Catholics, whereas the Young Ireland movement tries to be more non-sectarian.
Secular,
So,
yeah.
secular. So I kind of wondered, how much do we see maybe religious differences or also class differences in Ireland when it comes to this question of abolition?
I think it's class. The class component is to me the most important one, and certainly the vast majority of abolitionists in Ireland who are I should emphasize they're few in number, right? They're urban folks, right? They're Dublin, Belfast, Limerick, Cork, Galway, right? And they're dissenters. They're Quakers, Presbyterians, right? And the vast majority of the Irish population by this time is rural, Catholic, and relatively impoverished, more or less, right? And in all these ways, they are very different from the abolitionist movement. I think the one really important caveat there is that O'Connell was an abolitionist, right? And O'Connell is at the helm of the repeal campaign, which has a mass following among the rural Irish poor, right? Through what's called the repeal rent, where you can pay basically a penny per month for kind of contributing to the repeal campaign. They set up these reading rooms across Ireland that allows you to hear the news read to you of repeal, organization minutes and meetings and whatnot. And so while the Irish abolitionists and the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society have a really hard time, I think, breaking through to the quote unquote masses, right? O'Connell didn't, right? O'Connell's speeches are read or heard by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Irish people in the early to mid 1840s, including when Frederick Douglass, spoke alongside O'Connell at a repeal rally. And so that's where the Irish abolitionists thought they could make inroads, right? There's James Houghton is one of the co-founders of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society. I found in his correspondence, he's urging O'Connell throughout the early to mid 1840s to just not give up on wedding together the cause of Irish freedom with the cause of Black freedom, emancipation of slaves in the United States. So I think there was a genuine possibility of that happening, right? In some meaningful way. It's counterfactual to say, well, if the famine hadn't happened, how might it have played out, right? But the famine, of course, did happen, and that's when, and we can maybe get into it more, that's when this kind of faction of Irish nationalists known as Young Ireland really starts to make the argument that abolitionism is not just, again, irrelevant, but really inimical to the needs and the interests of Irish people.
Yeah. No, actually, that I was thinking about picking them up, and like, I mean, if we were talking counterfactual, I mean, we could also kind of ask, like, what would have been the kind of path of Ireland if it hadn't been O'Brien and others leading that 1848 revolution, but
Sure.
some more competent people with better planning. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, but no, I actually was. That's a great question, right? Of like what, like, I kind of liked that you had this interesting line in the book there, and when I read it, I kind of was like, well, it's sort of like, why should they care about people in another country when their own people in Ireland are starving, when they're trying to gain independence? It's sort of like I'm playing devil's advocate, like,
Yeah.
why should they not be selfish?
Right. And
Um,
so that argument, interestingly, it doesn't really come up until 1845. And O'Connell, the
mm,
repeal campaign starts in 1840. O'Connell is incessant in his kind of haranguing of Irish Americans who,
mhm,
refuse to denounce slavery and pro-slavery apologists. As I discussed in the book, he threatens repeatedly to return donations that
mhm,
come with any sort of indication of pro-slavery sentiments, right?
mhm,
I think he might have. It's not entirely clear
mhm,
if he ever actually followed through on that. But young Ireland nationalists reached this point in 1845 where they say, okay, enough is enough, right? That this is, especially in the context of what happens in 1845, which is, Angie Murphy's book has shown, is, the prospect of war now between
yeah,
Britain and America, right, with the annexation of
yeah,
Texas and, the kind of the fallout from that. And O'Connell seems to be saying that his opposition to slavery will lead him to side with Britain in this,
mhm,
potential conflict with the United States over Texas, right? And for some of the young Ireland nationalists, this is, kind of a bridge too far to go, right? That they say basically, if we're just going to be kind of taking the side of Britain here, then what are we actually doing?
yeah.
Especially if it's because of O'Connell's anti-slavery sentiments, which now this is really starting to weaken the cause of Irish sovereignty and not really respond to the needs of Irish people.
Yeah, and it's like how much money are we talking about that comes from slave states? Because the vast majority of the Irish migrant population is
Yeah.
in New England and New
Yeah.
York and the Midwestern parts of the country at this stage.
So it's not just the fact that it's from slave states necessarily. During the famine, there's a couple of particular donations from Baltimore and Charleston, South Carolina,
Hmm. Yeah.
and these are for famine relief. These aren't for Irish nationalist
Right.
organizations like the repeal movement, right? And the 1,200 pounds, 1,300 pounds for Irish famine relief. It's a drop in the bucket, I guess, in the grand scheme of the scale of relief from America. But O'Connell had been raising issues not just with donations to the repeal movement from slave states, but also with like repealers in Cincinnati
Mm.
who, basically say, we're not going to take sides with abolitionists, right? We support repeal, but this is not our fight, and we're not going to kind of join you in the taking up the cause of anti-slavery. So it's not just specific to donations from slave states, which are, as you point out, relatively lesser in comparison with the really vast amounts of money coming from like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, the major centers of Irish immigration up to the 1840s.
Yeah, and that's like I guess usually we say beggars can't be choosers, but in this case, it almost feels
Yeah,
like it a little bit.
yeah, yeah. No, it's so there's a newly published book called Aiding Ireland. It does a really good job looking at the debates over Irish famine relief, not just between in the United States in the South, but also looking at places like England and I think India.
Oh
And
wow.
basically makes the case that when people are debating Irish famine relief, or I should say contributing to it, they're really trying to shape their own interests or advance their own interests that are
Mhm.
localized, right? So enslavers that donate to Irish famine relief do so not out of a genuine concern or humanitarian concern, right? But to show that they're benevolent, that
Right.
abolitionist criticisms of them are baseless, right? And so that's in part that's what's happening there.
Or sort of we're sympathetic to a oppressed people wanting to gain freedom. That
Exactly.
probably came
Yeah.
in there as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Now, of course,
Yeah.
then we get to the beautiful moment where all these young Ireland lightning rods, let's call them for the moment, start to come to the United States as,
Yeah.
in some cases, refugees, exiles, or convicted felons.
Yeah.
Um, and we're talking like, I think that's important to note, right? We're talking about a small group of people. It's not like hundreds and thousands that were part of this movement. It's just dozens.
Yeah.
And they have this overblown impact on opinion in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. Really outsized to the what they had done in Ireland to advance the cause of Irish sovereignty or independence,
Yeah.
right? They had this miserably failed rising in 1848. As point out, a number of them are arrested and convicted of treason felon. Um, some escape, right? Some end up in a penal colony in Van Diemen's Land and then escape to America, right? So they kind of come in dribs and drabs between 1848 and kind of really building towards the arrival of John Mitchell, late in 1853. But Mitchell, especially, others, Thomas Francis Mayer, Michael Doheny, others that come to, I think, through as again, Keith McMahon has shown, through the Irish American press, really become the shapers of Irish nationalist thought in America, right? That Irish nationalism in America is really going to look differently thanks to the influence of the Young Ireland exiles than it had previously. And they make it more militant, more vehemently kind of, Anglophobic, kind of blaming England, as John Mitchell does in his book, The Last Conquest of Ireland, blames England for essentially creating genocide or genocidal conditions in Ireland for all intents and purposes. And that becomes the kind of motif of Irish American nationalism, is this kind of militancy, republicanist thought that says, just domestic sovereignty is not enough. There has to be a full and complete separation from Britain. There has to be revolution, if that's what it takes to do this. And you have all these Irish nationalist organizations that take shape in the 1850s and over the next several decades, really, that are based upon that line of thinking that is introduced by the Young Ireland exiles.
I was just, as you were talking, thinking like, in part, it's fascinating that you have this small group of failed revolutionaries that has such an oversized impact. Is it because they just like, because you have this exile community here in the United States? Is it because they're just seen as these failed freedom fighters that arrive in sort of a safe haven, or is it because like the other members of the repeal movement, they don't have to flee. They're staying in Ireland.
Right.
They're not having to leave. They're continuing the fight within the system against British oppression, if you like. So there is no intellectual opposition in the United States to them that gives them sort of an open field in which they can operate. Not to mention that they're having these hero welcomes.
Right. Right. So yeah, and it is important to point out, right, that there are Young Islanders, some of whom initially escape or flee, who do return to Ireland and don't sort of, take up this kind of more militant Republican form of nationalism. They decide they embrace a kind of constitutional nationalism, and basically working within the framework of the British Empire in order to seek greater domestic autonomy for Ireland, right? And kind of this is like pushing forward a bit, but interestingly, that faction will be most likely to support the Confederacy or oppose, the Union war effort, especially Irish participation in it during the Civil War. But I guess going back to the Young Irelanders in America, I think it's in part going back to this, the classic study of Irish immigration is Kirby Miller's Immigrants and Exiles. It goes way back several decades now, but it still remains the best kind of macro kind of interpretation of understanding Irish immigration. And basically he says that kind of Irish peasant culture was kind of predisposed to see emigration as a type of unwilling exile, even if it was done by the individual for rational, kind of socioeconomic chances of betterment, right? there was still this kind of cultural motif that held that, emigration was banishment, was exile. And so
Yeah.
for young Irelanders to kind of draw upon or call upon that kind of cultural reference point, I think had, of course, a lot of appeal for many folks who might have actually been doing quite well, perhaps, right?
Right.
Others, of course, who aren't doing well can look at that and say, well, it's because we had been held down in Ireland, right? That we aren't able to sort of make it here, right? And there's a lot of appeal in this notion that, it's not your fault, basically, that you've been kind of cast out by the
Right.
cruel hand of British oppression. And if you want revenge, then here's a program for you, right? It kind of has some overtones that sound familiar to today, perhaps, right? So I think they call upon that cultural reference point for what Irish immigrants understood
Yeah.
their movement to have been.
Yeah, sort of that diaspora kind of personality that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, yeah,
So, but I actually wondered about something else too, because when you because this is the young Ireland guys are dropping into the United States at a very volatile moment in the United States politically, right? We have the realignment
yeah.
politically, we have the demise of the Whig Party, we have them located primarily in New England, Philadelphia, New York,
New York, yeah,
Boston, cities, which as a result becomes a base for the American Party and nativism. And
yeah,
that eventually, of course, becomes part of the Republican Party. So they align initially with the Democratic Party. So how's just sort of also location where they are, political environment where they are, kind of aligning them with sort of the party of, for kind of simplicity purposes, the party of slaveholders.
yeah, yeah. So of course, I think I said earlier, right? This is, been one of the kind of previous explanations in scholarship is that it makes sense in a certain way for Irish immigrants, be they young Islander or exiles, or you're just kind of average common laborer
Mhm.
that is courted by the Democratic Party to kind of toe the party line in a basic sense, right? And not willingly rock the boat at a time, as you point out, that like nativism is coursing through American politics, right? The Know Nothing Party, just as John Mitchell arrives in 1853 and 54, the Know Nothings are gaining traction across big segments of Northern politics. And so in that environment, in that context, it makes a certain kind of political sense that you would kind of fall in line with where the Democratic Party was on the question of slavery and its expansion. It's interesting, right? Is that when Irish, young Islanders in particular, when they start writing about, as they do in one of the many newspapers they come to own or edit or contribute to in some form, right? They talk about the political divisions in America as mirroring some of the divisions within Irish nationalist politics that they had hoped to
Mhm.
have kind of left behind, right? So just to give one example, in 1849 and 50, the Irish temperance leader, Father Theobald Matthew, comes to America on this tour to try to win over Irish Americans and native-born Americans to the cause of
Mhm.
temperance, right? William Lloyd Garrison goes to visit him in Boston because back in 1841, Father Matthew had signed an address kind of led by Daniel O'Connell to Irish Americans, calling them to join with the abolitionists in America, right? And Garrison hopes, well, if you can get Father Matthew to renew this call for Irish Americans to join the abolitionist cause, he'll have some clout, maybe better than Garrison himself could do. Matthew refuses. It becomes this whole sort of a politically charged affair that's covered first in Garrison's Liberator, then it's picked up upon all across the country. And in Irish American newspapers, they say, look, this is the same thing that was happening to us back during the repeal years, right? I'm thinking of one editorial in particular. This is the very first causes of divisions within repeal was over this kind of pernicious issue of slavery. We really just need to kind of shunt this aside, and in this case, focus on Father Matthew's efforts to aid and uplift the Irish in America through the cause of temperance, right? And then very quickly after to keep together the Union amidst the crisis of 1850, right? So all to say, right, that while there is this kind of, clearly clearer influence of uh, distinctively American politics that exerts itself on young Irelanders and other Irish American figures, there's also ways in which they continue to kind of understand that the sequence of events that are playing out in the early mid 1850s as mirroring or in some ways, having been shaped by their backgrounds in Ireland.
Well, yeah, and I think that's the part that I kind of always find interesting because in part what the South, when it comes to secession, talks about is sort of the right for self-governance, right? And
Right.
that's
Right.
definitely appealing to Irish because it's like they would be like, oh yeah, we have argued that for decades now too. So yeah, we understand what you're talking about. So there's relational kind of similarities that they can, I guess, see in
Sure.
it.
Sure. And, Irish editorialists, editors, I should say, back in Ireland, especially as I mentioned, the kind of constitutional nationalist faction. Um, the Nation continues to exist as a newspaper, the Freeman's Journal in Ireland,
Mhm.
in Dublin, kind of really comes out very clearly on the side of the Confederacy and says this is just a movement to assert the right to self-government that we, the Irish people, are also seeking to assert for ourselves in our political relationship with the British Empire. Some Irish Americans in the northern states also kind of flirt with this, like famously Thomas Francis Meigher, initially is kind of hesitant. At
Mhm.
least it's written about that he's a little hesitant to embrace the Union war effort. Very kind of quickly sheds that hesitancy. But yeah, I think there's a certain logic by which Irish people on both sides of the Atlantic see the cause of the Confederacy as one being predominantly about self-governance, national determination, if you will, right? Especially because in the Union states, initially, of course, there's no urgent calls for emancipation to make this a war about slavery, at least, from the Lincoln administration, right? So they can kind of somewhat dishonestly
See
say
what you
this
want to
is not a
see.
war about slavery.
Yeah. You gotta
Yeah,
see what you want to see there. Before we get to the
exactly.
war, though, I wanted to briefly
Sure.
ask about because you mentioned it now a few times, newspapers. How, like we
Yeah.
have a for those that are not familiar, there's a very strong print culture in the United States that is oftentimes ethnically influenced, that ethnic groups have sort of their own newspapers, especially if they can maintain those with a large immigration population, which in the Irish case there is.
Sure.
So I think you mentioned that you were primarily looking at three Irish newspapers in the New York area. Was that like because those were like the mouthpieces of Irish like public opinion, or these were the shapers of, or was these different views that you found were going to be beneficial for your work, or why is
Yeah.
those?
No. So I looked at a number, but really four that I read basically from start to finish. You know, starting in like
You had a
1840 or
microfilm
so,
poisoning.
yeah, no, I spent a lot of time just, you know, on the microfilm reader for about a year and a half doing this. Back issue still around from that, but so it's the Boston Pilot, which has been for a long time seen as the kind of the most influential, most widely read Irish American newspaper of the 19th century. It's nicknamed at its time the Irishman's Bible, right? It's got I think at its peak around 100,000 subscribers, readers, right? So and more than that, readers, I should say, because of its being passed around and shared,
Yeah.
right? That it's just simply the most widely read Irish American newspaper. The New York Freeman's Journal, edited by, ironically, not an Irish American, James McMaster, is a kind of mouthpiece for the Roman Catholic hierarchy in New York
Hmm.
City. And so that seemed to be really a key, a key, source to kind of include to kind of get an Irish American Catholic kind of lens into the events that I
Mhm.
was tracking. The New York Irish American is a paper edited and owned by a kind of a succession of young Ireland exiles in New York
Mhm.
City, and is this kind of more non-sectarian
Mhm.
um,
Crazy
Irish point.
paper.
What's that?
The crazy guy's paper.
Yeah, right. And interestingly, I mean, gets into all sorts of disputes with both the
Yeah.
pilot and the Freeman Journal over kind of doctrinal issues, and to what extent should Irish nationalism be a Catholic movement, right?
Kind of
And I,
like the nation in
again,
Ireland was.
exactly, yeah. And then the Cincinnati Telegraph and Gazette, it goes through a couple of name changes in the period I'm looking at it, is owned and edited by the Purcell brothers,
Mm,
both Catholic clerics. One's the Archbishop of Cincinnati, I think it is, and kind of looking for a more Western, kind of trans-Appalachian, I guess, point of view, because, you do have a sizable Irish
mhm.
American population in the Old Northwest, right? Cincinnati, cities like Toledo, of course, Chicago, other kind of smaller, kind of growing semi-industrial cities out there. That's really the kind of the representative, I think, one of a good representative kind of voice for the Irish American viewpoint in the West.
No, and print media is important during this period, and it
Yeah.
gives us it sort of a gauge to public opinion in many ways. Uh,
Yeah, and I think I mean, what was most useful to me is the fact that they're all arguing with each other, right?
mhm.
They print and reprint each other's editorials,
Yeah,
heavy volume of letters to the editor, and there's,
that's nice.
it, it's a kind of open dialogue essentially,
Yeah.
right? It's not just, of course, it's not just factual reporting. That might be the least important part of them, right? Is it's really kind of a means of, voicing differing viewpoints and different interpretations of what's happening, and especially politically.
Yeah, and that made it that much more interesting. So
Right.
to the war, to the war.
Yeah.
And this was a really interesting part because, right, as you point out, Thomas Francis Mayer being initially very, very lukewarm on the cause of the Union, and then lukewarm on the cause of emancipation, but you kind of follow in the footsteps of a lot of scholarship with regard to soldiers going to war, then sort of seeing the reality on the ground and sort of becoming what I want to call you a practical abolitionist.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess to kind of set up how that occurs, and why um, folks who had, in some cases, very loudly spoken out against abolitionism led mobs to break up abolitionist meetings
Hmm.
in some cases that I study in the book, right?
Yeah.
You have to understand how prior to the war, and really almost in some ways amping up during it, there's this kind of Irish American unionist um, ideology, set of ideas that
Hmm.
kind of goes hand in hand initially with an Irish American critique of anti-slavery, right?
Hmm.
Irish American unionists see the union as a haven for immigrants, especially those who are, enduring oppression, economic calamity in Europe. They see it as a place where immigrants can find religious and political liberty that is unavailable to them in Europe, or specifically in Ireland. And unique to Irish Americans, of course, is the hope, and I think, for some, a very tangible prospect that America will be Ireland's ally in the cause of Irish
Hmm.
freedom, right? So these are the reasons why you would want a robust, politically, economically thriving United States, right? Because it can take in, the kind of quote unquote refugees of Europe. It can ensure them economic, political, religious prosperity and safety, and it can serve as an exemplar, if not an actual like military ally to would-be nationalists or revolutionaries back in Europe, in Ireland in particular, right? And it seems like that goes hand in hand in the antebellum period with a kind of anti-abolitionist kind of critique, which is that, well, abolitionism, really by the time of the 1850s, it's kind of anti-slavery writ large,
Hmm.
is dividing the country. This is the argument that Irish American unionists make, and doing so in a way that does a disservice that is, again, just like it had been in Ireland, it's now inimical to the interests of Irish American people. So, leading into the war, those two things go hand in hand, right? Irish American critique of anti-slavery seems to fit nicely with this Irish American unionist strain of thought. And for reasons we can maybe get into how this unfolds kind of on the ground, the dynamics of war, unanticipated outcomes of war on the ground, just completely, not completely, but for many, just really call into question the notion that acting in the interest of protecting and even expanding slavery is acting in the interest of the Union, right? If you now have this rebellion that's being waged as folks come to understand that are in this, marching through the South, seeing enslaved people, coming into their lines, not just to secure their freedom, but also to provide them with military intelligence, end up working in their Union encampments, right? It very quickly starts to cause one to question, all right, are we really serving the interests of unionism by trying to protect the institution of slavery that is very clearly now on the side of breaking up the Union?
Yeah, no, and I was actually thinking because that's again, it's a very pragmatic kind of approach there is that
Yeah,
it's a manner taking. It also sort of means that we're not overcoming sort of racial perceptions about African American, right? It's sort of like
yeah.
because I see your emancipation now as a war goal that will shorten the war by weakening the South doesn't mean I believe you're equal to me or that you should have the same rights as me. Um,
Sure. And I think in that way, right, Irish Americans who come to embrace emancipation very much mirror a pretty wide swath of the general kind of,
yeah.
northern populace, right? Um, I do find, the book tries to make the point that there are varying degrees of enthusiasm with which,
Mhm.
Irish Americans come to, embrace the demise of slavery and want to actively contribute towards, right? There are instances I find where I think you find something of a genuine kind of humanitarian revulsion
Mhm.
at slavery when Irish American soldiers encounter it, in reality, when they encounter enslaved people, especially, and find themselves, driving the same wagon together in the case of like a teamster, a black teamster that's driving the wagon of this Irish American editorialist who's writing letters back to the New York Irish American. And there's that on the one hand, right? But then there's other times where it's a matter of simply, well, I have to do this because I'm a soldier and I have to obey orders. And if the orders now include enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, then I'm going to do that, right? So there's a pretty wide spectrum in terms of how eager, how enthusiastic Irish Americans are in their embrace of emancipation. I think really importantly, though, they wouldn't have done so. I say kind of at a critical mass if it had not been for kind of the continued evolution of the relationship between Ireland and America during the war.
No, and I mean, we could go down the Fenians and kind of the Irish Republican Brotherhood as well, and kind of singing like how
Yeah,
that group influences viewpoints. But in part too, because you have so many, you bring out so many different voices in the chapters with regard to the Civil War that kind of talk
yeah,
about like that, what's the kind of like the training of Irish soldiers for the future conflicts in Britain, sort of the changing of attitude towards slavery and emancipation. But I also kind of was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on sort of the notion of like how much was some of this change in thinking officers versus the average
yeah,
soldier, which of course is very hard to get to because the average soldier
sure.
oftentimes doesn't leave us the records that we would like to kind of gauge their
Right.
interest and ideas.
Yeah, and I think obviously, right, the lot of ink been spilled on the common soldier of the Civil War, and the kind of perils of relying upon soldiers' letters that overrepresent
Mhm.
better educated, more affluent soldiers, oftentimes officers, right? I don't find that to be the necessarily a problem though, because in some ways I'm looking at, well, who are the influential figures in Irish America who could serve as kind of, models or, folks that others would look to and say, okay, well, if Thomas Francis Meyer is now stumping on behalf of Lincoln in 1864, that's significant, right? He's, as we talked about, right? The Young Irelanders have this kind of clout with Irish Americans.
Yeah.
And as Mayor, others speak out on behalf of emancipation. for the Lincoln administration later in the war. Yeah, I find that to be a key development, and there's no telling how much that trickles down to the kind of the rank and file in the army to you know common laborers in the streets of New York, right? And there's good evidence to suggest in New York certainly that it didn't, right? Because you have the draft riots.
Yeah, we're gonna
But
get there in a minute.
whether it's yeah, sure. But whether it's officers like Mayor and others, at the more junior level, whether it's prominent Catholic clerics, Irish American newspaper editors, Irish American nationalists who don't necessarily serve in the Union Army but kind of remain influential kind of on the sidelines.
Mhm.
I think those, as I look at it in the last chapter, these kind of influential figures that give arguments for emancipation, I think are really important to kind of take note of. And there's kind of like dribs and drabs of evidence that,
Mhm.
there's letters from a private soldier in Massachusetts, for instance, about how he read an O'Connell speech from 1843 in the Wheeling Intelligencer, and that he's sending it along to another buddy in the army, right? So you see this kind of little small signs that discourse at the top is kind of filtering down below to some degree. And I think especially within Irish Americans in the army.
Yeah, no, I mean that's makes total sense that the officers talk about things and the soldiers start to pick up on it. Um, Draft riot. That is a
Yeah.
very big part of your book, and I guess we can easily say one of the linchpins of misinterpreting Irish attitudes towards race, right?
Yeah. And I guess I try to state, and I don't want to downplay and de-emphasize the significance of the draft riots and what they kind of tell us about um, racism in America, Irish American
Hmm.
racism in particular, right? But what I found in researching for the book is a substantial body of evidence that there is a kind of counter narrative of Irish
Hmm.
American involvement and then reactions to the draft riots. That there are soldiers in the Union Army who are writing to their officers and petitioning to be sent to New York to take part in kind of subduing the rioters.
That was crazy.
There's a kind of a history of Irish American Catholic clerics that are providing shelter and protection to Black New Yorkers who are fleeing
Mhm.
this kind of pogrom of violence initiated by Irish-born wage laborers primarily. And then for in the months that follow from this, there are these really vehement denunciations of the draft rioters from Irish American soldiers, from Irish American newspaper editors. Clerics continue to kind of condemn the rioters all across. Catholic clerics continue to condemn the riots in the months that follow from it. So to me, this kind of represents not necessarily, it's the draft riots are oftentimes framed as kind of this like brutal coda to
Mhm.
the history of Irish Americans involvement in the debate over slavery, and really is in some ways as a pivotal moment in race relations in America, right? This is a signal for the white working class to indicate their brutal hostility to the Black freedom, right?
Mhm.
And that's true. At the same time, there's this kind of, as I said, kind of a counter narrative that emerges in the aftermath of really during the riots, but especially afterwards, that I just wanted to kind of just call attention to, because I think it helps to explain why in the 2 years after the riots, you still have Irish Americans serving in the Union Army, speaking on behalf of the Union war effort, and in some ways continuing to come out in favor of emancipation, by 2 years later after July 1863.
Yeah, and I just was looking because you had like these like two Irish officers who are actually being
Yeah.
attacked by the mob. So it's sort of like it's almost a little bit of an Irish internal civil war happening there in New York City.
Yeah, yeah, no.
Not
So,
sure it's the right way to go with it, but
no, but I think it's, I call attention to it because I think the way that these incidents happen is revealing, right? So one is
Mhm.
this Colonel Hugh O'Brien, is a New York officer of a New York regiment. He's sent home to try to recruit to, refill the depleted ranks of his unit. And while he's in New York, the draft riots break out, right? And he basically, steps up to say, I'll take my recruits, will help to kind of restore order in the streets. He's at the helm of this detachment of Union soldiers that really brutally suppresses the rioters. They supposedly kill several innocent bystanders, including an infant child who's looking on from a window. And later on the day, O'Brien finds that his house has been ransacked. He kind of, goes back to his neighborhood and finds this crowd awaiting him. He brazenly steps into a drugstore to seek out supposedly something to drink, and he's set upon by this mob. And the descriptions are just vivid in the kind of gory detail with what they do to this guy, and it mirrors the exact same type of kind of treatment that they give in the worst cases to Black New Yorkers who are really brutally set upon by the mobs that are roaming the streets. And so I think that that's significant, right? They see Hugh O'Brien in some ways, right, not to overemphasize that point, but as being part and parcel with the Black New Yorkers who come to represent the detested policy of emancipation, this war for emancipation that wage laborers are now being conscripted into, allegedly. The other guy is Colonel Robert Nugent. He is an officer in the Irish Brigade. He is recovering from an injury, and he's the provost marshal in New York City, who's basically tasked with carrying out conscription in New York City on the day of the riots, right? So you can understand that the mob would see him as someone to take issue with. They visit his apartment, they go in and they ransack it, right, loot it, but they interestingly they take away a sword that he'd been gifted by Mayor Thomas Francis Mayer as a gift as a fellow Irish Brigade officer. And they also destroy a picture of him and Mayer together, right? So they kind of are very consciously targeting these symbols, like material symbols of the Irish participation in the Union war effort, right? So that to me was just telling, right? That this is maybe not a civil war, right? But clearly a recognition that there are fundamentally conflicting, perspectives among Irish Americans on the Union war effort by this point in 1863.
I will say that I'm impressed based on what you said, because in your book you say, quote, beaten to death over the course of 6 hours for O'Brien, which is sort of like, I can't even fathom like how it takes somebody 6 hours to be beaten to death. Like
no, it's
insane.
I think I left out some of the goriest details
Thankfully,
because it just seemed kind of excessive. Yeah, but it's horrific, right?
But
in the same manner that hundreds of Black New Yorkers are, and oftentimes mutilated, right? They do the same thing to this Irish-born colonel.
Yeah. And I kind of wondered as I was reading it, how much, because you have here Irish people in the US Army saying, that's not us, and we're willing to fight this and subdue these fellow Irishmen who are rising up against the draft and trying to prevent us from ending this war. So you have this duality of two Irish groups. And I kind of wondered, because this is New York after all, how much does that impact the community long term? Because does it sort of leave like in the United States, we know that the Civil War leaves massive reconciliation problems between North and South, and veterans don't ever really forgive each other for what's going on. How's that in the Irish community? Do the Irish soldiers come back to New York and it's sort of like it's in the past, or is this sort of like Irish soldiers come back to New York and are like, you were in the draft riot, you're a troublemaker?
No, so I mean, in the short term, like the Irish Brigade coming back to New York late in 1863, early 1864, again to kind of refill their really depleted ranks by this point in time. And whereas when the core unit of the Irish Brigade, the 69th New York, had been one of the initial 3-month regiments of the war in 1861, they returned and got this hero's welcome. The New York Irish Brigade units got all these kind of hero send-offs back in 1861 and 62. When they come back in 1864, it's kind of just a whole lot of nothing among New Yorkers. They have their own kind of reception and banquet in which they more or less acknowledge that they are not necessarily shunned, but it's not the same kind of celebratory air about it that it had been 2 or 3 years earlier when they went off to the war. The long term is a question I don't explore too much in the book in New York City, at least. Susanna Bruce is really outstanding study of Irish Americans in the Civil War era, The Harp and the Eagle, kind of covers Irish American memory of the Civil War and how Irish Americans kind of consciously constructed this history of loyal, unionist service during the war and in the decades that followed. Very much covering over the involvement in the draft riots, not just in New York City, but of course, opposition to the draft and conscription all across the Union states. So I think that was very much the case in New York as well, right? You'll have certain figures that are held up as models for Irish immigrants in the future to kind of follow by. But the draft riots do have this lingering memory among New Yorkers and even kind of national figures like Thomas Nast, right? So Thomas Nast political cartoons through the 1870s will oftentimes feature, if you look closely, kind of in the background, the Colored Orphans Asylum in New York City kind of burning to the ground, or kind of apishly depicted Irish immigrants murdering Black people in the streets as a kind of symbol of the kind of the Copperhead Irish kind of involvement in opposing conscription and emancipation.
Yeah. All right. We're at, I think, just over an hour. So at this stage, I want to briefly talk about John Mitchell because he is just such a wonderful lightning rod when it comes to Irish studies during the American Civil War period. So in like 2 or 3 sentences, what's your opinion on John Mitchell? And then we can go into details.
Sure. So he, as we talked about earlier, he is, I think, the key figure in the reinvention of Irish American nationalism. Right? It's through his writings, there are a couple of different books that he publishes in the 1850s and 60s that we get this articulation of grievance against Britain for the famine. The idea that the famine was intentional. He famously says, God Almighty sent the potato blight, but England created the famine, right? I grew up in Massachusetts, right? So Massachusetts is one of only, I think, a couple of states where you're taught about the Great Irish Potato Famine as an act of genocide, and comparable to like the Armenian genocide, right? So this in Massachusetts, this has a very long life, right? And I think he, more than any other young Ireland exile, refashioned Irish American nationalism, but I think we've kind of erred in looking at him as representative of Irish American views on slavery and slavery's future in America during the Civil War era.
Guilty
I
as
can expand
charged.
on that if you like, or
No, I'll take guilty as charged in that case, since I did use him in Liberty and Slavery quite a little bit, as sort of a Southern representation of Irish.
So I think it's telling, right, that he has this famous incident in 1854 where, in response to an Irish abolitionist, James Houghton, who asked him to, in America, denounce slavery, join the abolitionists, Mitchell writes back and infamously says, not only will he not do this, but he wishes for a plantation in Alabama well stocked with, Black slaves, and uses different terminology that's much more vulgar, right? And folks have pointed to that and said, well, that's the Irish American point of view, right? It's telling, though, that Mitchell, very soon after that, ends up moving down to Tennessee, and then from there on to Virginia. The Citizen, his newspaper in New York City, where he publishes this letter to Houghton, loses, in his own words, tens of thousands of subscribers in like the drop of a hat, right after he publishes this letter. And again, in the book, what I try to show is that just like there's a kind of counter narrative to the draft riots, there's a counter narrative to Mitchell's Alabama plantation letter, where young Ireland nationalists in America denounce him, saying, I'm with Mitchell all the way, except here. Some explicitly say, Irish nationalists should never be found on the side of the oppressor, right? I'm trying to think, I think it's Michael Doheny says this really more or less directly. And other Irish Americans writing at the time, newspaper editorialists especially, but even kind of ordinary folks who are made plain in letters, they say Mitchell lost a good deal of his influence by coming out so stridently in support of slavery, right? So I think that's telling of where Irish Americans as a whole were, right? That they are anti-abolitionists in the antebellum period, but they're not the same type of like militant pro-slavery that many abolitionists at the time, and you know, some folks in kind of in a long body of scholarship afterwards have kind of assumed them to be.
Yeah, and I mean, Mitchell had always a history of putting his foot in his mouth, right? I mean, that's
Sure.
like that's why they kicked him out as a nation, right? Where he went got
Yeah.
tried in Ireland, so that him coming to the United States shouldn't surprise us that he does something very similar again, which
Yeah. Yeah.
of course, then you have this whole like I mean, when we think of his history, right? Then he joins the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood, goes to Europe, but comes back to like side with the Confederacy and write for a
Yeah.
Richmond
Has two
paper.
sons that, yeah,
To
two sons that
yeah,
lose their life
yeah,
fighting
and
for the
he
Confederacy.
criticizes Davis's government as not like
Yeah.
revolutionary enough. So he's just
Yeah.
this he's this odd character in so many regards. That
Yeah. And infamously, you know, argued for reopening the transatlantic slave trade, you know, just on
yeah,
the war too, right? So yeah, well, and again, I don't want to minimize. I think that there is a certain segment of Irish America prior to the Civil War that,
mhm.
you know, maybe wouldn't have gone as far as Mitchell in these ways. Certainly didn't voice it publicly, but probably sympathized with him and was certainly as, you know, vehemently anti-abolitionist as he was, right? And shared his views on abolitionists as being foolish, you know, kind of extremists who you know ignored, as Mitchell charged, ignored poverty in their own backyard, be it in Ireland or in America. I think that's a very widely shared viewpoint among Irish Americans, just as it had been, I think, among the young Irelanders back in Ireland during the famine.
Yeah, and considering I'm just thinking Garrison was spoke out against Mitchell quite a bit, and I want to say it was in Garrison's paper where wasn't it a suggestion that Mitchell should hang himself or go back to Ireland because of the things he's had said about slavery?
I don't know. I don't know about that one, but I know that like Henry Ward Beecher's newspaper, I think it's the Brooklyn Independent, I think it was, basically says in the aftermath of Mitchell's Alabama plantation letter, if this was the tree that was sprouting in Ireland, we should tear it out root and stem, basically,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And for Irish Americans, this is bad because like this is how Americans and you know a growing segment of anti-slavery Americans will come to see Irish nationalists. This you know threatens their prospective support for the cause of Irish nationhood.
yeah. But I was thinking also in regard to like the argument of your book because that's very much encapsulates sort of what you're saying, this sort of dilemma in regard to abolition, right? Of like
Yeah,
should we embrace abolition? Should we not embrace abolition? And you have these young Irish nationalists like Mitchell who are like, no, it's not our cause. It doesn't matter. And um, the only focus we have is our independence, not what happens in this U.S. South. Um,
yeah, yeah. No, and I think that in a certain sense, even those Irish who come to embrace emancipation during the war, as they argue, do so not again for any sort of humanitarian sentiment out of some sort of moral conviction that enslaving African Americans is wrong, but to go back to the kind of Mitchellite perspective, right? Because what is most paramount is aiding the cause of Irish freedom. The best way to do that now is to, just eliminate the root cause of this conflict that is preventing Americans and Irish Americans from doing.
yeah, and so yeah, how about Mayor? He's also a young
Mayor, so
Irelander, but
yeah,
he's not as crazy as Mitchell.
in a certain sense, no,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I mean,
Mayor's
he
to me,
drowns in Montana, so I guess he's as
right?
crazy as Mitchell.
Yeah, so Mayor's he's a compelling figure to me. That's I think there's a recent biography of him, Timothy Egan's The Immortal Irishman, that I think in some ways tried to resurrect Mayer a little bit, and I think
Hmm.
for the better. I'm generally kind of in agreement with his interpretation of Mayer's life and career.
Hmm.
Um, Mayer's a braggart. He's kind of very loquacious, silver tongue to the point of kind of, of just being all talk, for lack of a better phrase, in the eyes of some contemporaries and in the eyes of a number of historians, up until quite recently, I think. Um, he's got an unsavory reputation in some respects. He's alleged to be a drunkard, alleged to drink while in command on the battlefield in a number of occasions. And of course, leaves his wife and child in Ireland, basically kind of abandons them while in exile. Never really made an effort to kind of reunite with them. But I think that he's someone that he spoke in the vocabulary of his time in a way that was maybe more elegant than many other Irish Americans, but that was in a basic sense understood by them. Right, the arguments he makes in 1863, 64 for why Irish Americans, and he more or less says this, have to admit they were wrong about the need to preserve the Union by acting in the interest of enslavers, and need to embrace emancipation because that is the cause of, he says in the letter, all true Republicans, a lowercase r, not the formal Republican Party, right? If you are a Republican, someone interested in the preservation and expansion of Republican democracy, then you need to understand now that this project is only possible with the elimination of slavery from the United States, because A, the country cannot go on as it is. Right? It's going to be just continuously divided and at war with each other. But B, Marr comes to kind of recognize, I think, that there is a kind of moral stain on the American Republic from slavery, and that removing that stain will thereby aid the broader cause of kind of Republican government around the world. And I think he's genuine in that. I also think he sees it directly as being applicable to Ireland first and foremost. So yeah, I tend to kind of have a more favorable position on interpretation of Marr's loquaciousness maybe than other folks have. But I do think that he's someone that maybe has been written off in a certain way that is worth kind of re-looking at now.
Yeah, no, I agree that he's a very, very fascinating figure, and I enjoyed researching for my book, so I hope others will give him some attention. But as the last question, I'm going to throw you a little curveball because you're a historian of Irish people in the United States. I have dabbled a little bit in that. Right, after a small technical delay, as you can see, Ian is now on a little different perspective with us. I'm gonna want to ask our last question for today, and that is, considering how much work has been done on the Irish, and this is the Irish during the American Civil War, military studies, political studies, the Fenians. There's so many books. Where do we go from there? Like, what's the unwritten page in the history of the Irish, especially in the United States, Ian?
Yes, I mean, it is a field where it might be hard for dissertation students now to find the unwritten part of Irish American history at the very least. And I think the field of Irish studies has really moved recently towards a more, as I mentioned, I think a little bit earlier, kind of diasporic framework, looking at the kind of connectivity between different nodes of the Irish diaspora, and how that diaspora and those connections took shape over time, how they changed over time, and looking at how localized contexts, right, the Irish in Australia or South Africa or Canada or America, how those localized contexts shaped Irish communities, while at the same time those communities themselves remained kind of part of this larger diasporic network, and had a diasporic identity to them. I think that's where the really exciting work in the field has been, maybe for a while now, but it continues to kind of produce, as I mentioned earlier, this study of Irish famine relief that looks at Charleston, New York, London, India, right, and kind of looks at them as part of a interconnected web of the Irish diaspora, right? I also think, personally, my next project is kind of moving on from the Irish, so I won't be in the field at least for the short term. I think there's maybe more that can be done. Way back in like the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of attention to like smaller, maybe even rural Irish American history. I say smaller places like Butte, Montana, for instance, right, where it's the most Irish place in America. by the late 19th century, like per person, right? You're talking about like I think 40% or so of Butte in the 1880s, 1890s is Irish born, right? But I think there's more space perhaps for looking at the period I'm most interested in remains so is the kind of mid 19th century Civil War era. The town I currently live in Massachusetts is a very much a kind of classic small kind of Yankee community, right? But in the course of doing research for revisions for the book, I discovered, well, there's like half dozen or so Irish immigrants that are working in like a straw hat factory in the town. They live in this little kind of cordoned off area of it, like this really miniature kind of Irish town, basically. And they all enlist together in this kind of Yankee, company and serve the duration of the war together. And then in their personal reminiscences of the war for the local GAR unit that they're all a part of afterwards, they talk about their service alongside each other, right? So I think Ryan Keating's relatively recent book, Shades of Grey, kind of tried to look beyond, the New York, Boston, Philadelphia kind of stories, right? So maybe looking at those kind of lesser studied places, where the Irish are part of, less homogeneously Irish American communities would be a field for further research in.
Yeah, sort of like what you have with a lot of other immigrant groups that are too small to form their own regiments and that
exactly
are like minor in size. No, that sounds like there's still a lot of work that PhD students can do if they really want to do the Irish.
Yeah. And looking at it, maybe bridging in some ways that kind of like really hyper local history with the larger, kind of imperial and diasporic networks that Irish immigrants are a part of would be really fascinating.
A micro history and a macro history.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is kind of what my new project is doing, but on a much different topic. So maybe there'll be room for the Irish, down the road.
There's always room for a Guinness, right? All right. Well, thank you, Ian, so much for taking the time today. And just for everyone who got interested in the book or wants to know more about John Mitchell, Thomas Francis Meyer, and the rest of the young Irishmen that come to the United States, the book is Embracing Emancipation, a Transatlantic History of Irish American Slavery and the American Union by Fordham University Press. Thank you so much, Ian. It was a pleasure today.
No, Niels, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. The chance to, talk for this long about the book. I could keep going, but appreciate the questions and conversation.
I know it wasn't for the listeners' attention span, I would be happy to go for another hour, but
no, I think we've given plenty to the listeners. So yeah.